Sara, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Seance. Sara.
Yes, can you hear me?
Because I can't hear her.
Oh.
Do you? Because I don't. Sara, so if you could just share your screen, if you can share your screen with us, that would be great. Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Yeah, so you just share your screen. That'll be the easiest thing.
I need the permission to share my screen.
Okay, so while the host does that, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We were really excited about this panel when we put it together, and we're really happy that it's finally happening. Thank you to Kira and all the organizers for making this conference happen. And welcome to our panel. So the first paper is Sara Castro Font's Hipsters and Drunks, Tourists and Locals, Calle Luisa as a Site of Ideological Contestation.
Sorry, hi, everybody can see my screen, right? Hello, everybody. My name is Sara, and today I will be presenting Hipsters and Drunks, Tourists and Locals, Calle Luisa as a Site of Ideological Contestation. A few years ago, I was walking back home from a beach in San Juan with a friend when a person who I'm calling here Dad approached us. Walking beside us with his bike, he asked us if we spoke English and if we were from San Juan. He was from the United States and wanted recommendations for restaurants nearby. Our first response was to visit Calle Luisa, as it was walking distance from the beach. At that time, Calle Luisa was becoming popular for its emerging coffee shops, bars, and vegan and vegetarian restaurants. It had been undergoing development since 2012, the impacts of which have been most salient after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Much to my surprise, Jack was already well acquainted with the street because he had been living in Puerto Rico for 2 months. Curious to know more, I asked what brought him there. He responded that he was about to open a Latin American Asian fusion restaurant at Calle Luisa. At that time, I thought, of all places, why Puerto Rico? While this was maybe naive of me to think at the time, it also came from knowing and experiencing how residents struggle economically on a daily basis. But the story has been different now for new incoming residents from the United States. Puerto Rico is a US colony since 1898, and since 1952, it's been designated as a free associated state. Fast forward to the present moment, Puerto Rico has seen rising immigration flows and a 36% decrease in its younger population, while also a 49% increase in people moving from the US, many of them investing in properties to open restaurants and other such businesses. This rise can be linked to Acts 20 and 22, which are policies that provide tax exemptions and new profit opportunities for any new resident of the island, benefits that exclude islander residents. In 2018, the US Congress proclaimed 98% of Puerto Rico's land as an opportunity zone, which are low-income areas to be used for urban development programs. For a frame of reference, only up to 23% of low-income areas can be used as opportunity zones in a state. As shown by many scholars, such neoliberal policies tend to increase social inequality and differentiation while benefiting the upper class. Calle Luisa is a popular street in the district of Santurce. Located in the capital of San Juan, Santurce is a working-class urban district historically marked by ruptures of economic development projects that have displaced and brought forth different waves of populations across time. It is San Juan's most densely populated neighborhood, with a diverse mix of Afro-Puerto Ricans, mixed Afro and white Hispanic Puerto Ricans, as well as immigrants from neighboring Caribbean islands, especially the US Virgin Islands. Over the last decade, Santurce has been impacted by these neoliberal policies that provide tax exemptions for foreign investors and that foster urban revitalization projects that focus on turning low-income residential areas into tourist zones. The tourism industry has been heavily intersecting with urban revitalization projects. In this context, developers have relied on cultural strategies to reconfigure Calle Loíza as San Juan's official cultural and gastronomic center for both local and tourist consumption. Now, bounded to this context, cultural strategies for urban development and tourism have been widely studied. But specific to Calle Loíza is how longtime local residents converge with non-resident locals, as well as with tourists, new business owners, and emerging local artists. This intertwining of subjects who live, consume, and visit the area produces multiple interpretations of the street. Rather than focusing on how cultural strategies are used for urban development and tourism, this study focuses on the ideological dimensions of the street and how they become articulated in its linguistic and semiotic landscape. In this paper, I address how is Calle Loíza discursively constructed and what ideologies underlie these discourses. Linguistic and semiotic landscape studies provide ways to talk about how language plays a role in shaping meanings of spaces. I understand semiotic landscapes as all the displayed and interwoven discourses about a space and used it as a methodological and conceptual tool to analyze online discourses about Calle Loíza along restaurant Facebook pages and customer reviews, TripAdvisor, tourism websites, and La Calle Loíza's community Facebook page. I also draw from photographic documentation conducted throughout the summer of 2020. Calle Loíza is understood here as a site of ideological work. Drawing from this term enabled me to expand linguistic and semiotic landscape analysis onto digital spaces, so as not to overlook alternative ways in which social agents contribute to and engage with meanings of space in digital ways. As we will see in a portion of this video, Calle Loíza's meaning as a successful, revitalized area is rendered through discourses that highlight the street's musical, creative, and artistic qualities.
Why is this special? Why is this neighborhood special?
It was a very important commercial area in mid-20th century. It was like the place where everybody came to do their shopping. So it's always been very musical, and many artists lived around here and still do. So it is a mixed neighborhood with commerce and residents.
So the history is here, it's everywhere. And then this restaurant renaissance that has been happening, right?
Yeah, a lot of young people, they've been moving in and starting new projects. Really a cultural zone where you know, we got neighbors, we got a pedestrian life, and it's a community.
I feel like when people think of tourism, they think big chain hotel, all-inclusive resort, like the Piña Colada, and that's it. But I mean, there's real amazing experiences to be had here in Calle Loíza, and you can go out every night.
You know, you could go out from Monday to Monday and you find restaurants are open. There's typical music from hip hop to Bombay Plena. There's places that are playing jazz. There's places that are playing reggaeton. You can find whatever you like.
So, well, there is a lot to unpack in that video. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm interested on what they say that makes the street special. And they focus on the artistic, cultural, and musical dimensions of the street. Many scholars have pointed out that the increasing inclusion of culture and arts serve as anchors in neoliberal urban development policies to reshape spaces, as they depend on symbolic economies of spectacle, heritage, branding, and tourism. In line with these discourses, the street is filled with museum texts about the artists and musicians who grew up in the neighborhood. These museum texts are part of a multidisciplinary street exhibition about musicians, their biographies, and their musical contributions to plena, which is an Afro-Puerto Rican musical genre. They form part of the interdiscursive web that makes up Calle Loíza's semiotic landscape, aligning with discourses that repack the street's meaning as a creative and musical space. For a long time, the Caribbean has been strategically branded as a tropical paradise, or to use Thompson's concept, the Caribbean has been tropicalized for tourist consumption. However, we don't see this kind of branding in this video. Instead, there is a focus on reorganizing working class urban areas as artistic and cultural attractions for tourists. Most reviewers on TripAdvisor also describe Calle Loíza as an upcoming area, as vibrant, artsy, and a hipster street filled with hip and cool places to eat and hang out. By highlighting Calle Loíza's uniqueness, these discourses value the street as a creative space, which is a quality more explicitly articulated in the street's culinary scene. Most restaurants promoted their dishes as unique, and most customers valued the restaurant's creativity in their reviews. But why is creativity, however, the major quality highlighted about Calle Loíza? These discourses only reflect that creativity is highly valued within the current neoliberal political economy. According to Wilf, neoliberalism is marked by a condition of uncertainty due to its changing employment rates, financial crisis, and increasing privatization of essential services. As a result, subjects are increasingly required to be flexible and capable of imagining and realizing futures that exceed constraints. This kind of neoliberal agency brings forth the value of creativity and uniqueness as a result of a need to fashion futurities in ambiguous and uncertain situations. On the tourism website, Calle Loíza is often described as a flourishing site, undergoing renewal, suggesting that it has exceeded some degree of limitations. As such, Calle Loíza has been interpreted by some as a creative site, signified by its vibrant artistic and musical qualities that index revitalization and uniqueness. Tourism has been used to mask urban crisis and create an image that served to envision a better future for a city. Scholarship has shown that when oriented to maximize profit, tourism exacerbates the living conditions of residents. Indeed, comments on the community's Facebook page highlight very different qualities of the street than those discussed until now. This further shows how people's different degrees of accessibility to frameworks of knowledge, coupled with their positioning in political economic structure, generate contrasting perceptions of Calle Loíza. On the community's Facebook page, most users comment on the decreasing quality of life for the neighbors and instead emphasize the street's undesirable qualities. They highlight an increase in violent tensions, and instead of celebrating new businesses, they highlight the need to close them down. Some users note that the character of the neighborhood is getting lost, and they see it as becoming dangerous and violent. For example, this user highlights the feeling of danger that increases as other publics come into the area. Contrary to how restaurant reviewers highlight a sense of similarity and safety in restaurants, this comment points to the obstruction of the longer-standing meaning of Calle Loíza as a residential site. For this user, this disruption and presence of bodies is translated into noise and a lot of alcohol. Through these discourses highlighting opposing qualities, Calle Loíza is then characterized either as a lively or a deadly place. The signs invoked in these discourses are understood as part of a schema of contrast that characterizes the street either as a site of progress or a site of degeneration. Common throughout the discourses was the invocation of figures or certain types of people associated with a semiotic display to index differing meanings of the street. On the one hand, people invoked the figure of the hipster to celebrate Calle Loíza's progress, whereas others worked a figure of the drunk to highlight its degeneration. Hipsters can be described as young adults with a set of particular tastes and patterns of consumption pertaining to the creative class and who share an appreciation for mobility and discovering new modes of being. The drunks are presumed to be those drawn to the emerging bars and restaurants, leading to increased violent tensions among groups. Both figures are closely associated to patterns of consumption practices. Noting these figures provides a way to not only talk about the groups that are imagined to inhabit the street, but also to think about how qualities of social personae become projected onto an entire space. Figures are thus discursive strategies that orient social agents to either align with or disassociate themselves from the perceived qualities of the street through consumption practices. For instance, some may invoke the figure of the drunk to distance themselves from roles as consumers of the street and to embody a critical stance against the notion of the street as a site of progress. This concept then serves to point to how groups of people use discursive strategies in their crafting of the self and create senses of belonging or unbelonging. It also points to how bodies combine to give meanings and value to space, bringing forth the essential role that bodies play in the shaping of semiotic landscapes. Calle Loíza is thus a site of ideological contestation in which an array of subjects and subjectivities come together in a single shared space. Studying the ideologies that underlie discourses of Calle Loíza can lead to understandings of how people may view the same object or phenomena, such as an abandoned building or the opening of a bar, as an index of progress and others as an index of degeneration. Semiotic landscapes also offer a compelling way to study spaces as sites of ideological work and to understand how some material signs in space embody the multiple discourses that characterize or build social spaces. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. So, okay. Is this working? Oh, but I want to start with the video. Do you want to try? Do you want to try this?
Just close her. I cannot go any further than this for some reason.
I can just do it without it. I mean, I don't. Give it 30 seconds. Right. Let's see. I'm just gonna. I'm sorry, I'm gonna be boring and not show anything, even though I had a video and everything, because it's, you know, panels take an extra 45 minutes, and that's really unfair to everyone. So I'm gonna try and be entertaining with just my voice. I'll try my best. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so the title of my talk is Racial and Political Subjectivity in Second Generation Internal Migrants in Lima, Peru. So I had a video of this, but I'll just narrate it to you. In Victoria Santa Cruz's legendary poem, she explains, "I was not even 7 when suddenly some voices yelled at me, negra, and am I perhaps black, I wondered, and I felt black, and I retreated," my translation. In the poem, the speaker experiences violence as a young child, beginning a journey that leads eventually to a powerful sense of self-acceptance, of pride in her Afro-Peruvian identity. Over multiple encounters, the speaker in the poem retreats, as the somatic features of her body are contextualized by others as iconic of a blackness that is deemed inferior per the colonial schematics of racialization in Peru. In the end, the speaker comes to reject the dampening of her blackness, thanking God for the darkness of her skin and refusing to relax her hair. Hers is a political awakening across confrontations with racism, and the poem, a political call to action. Santa Cruz achieves her own reintextualization, reinstantiating the resignified sign vehicle negra, now indexing pride, artistic praxis, and resistance. In the Andes, and perhaps Latin America writ large, these categories are co-constitutive, and their disarticulation and resignification through multiple other intertextualizations, while separate projects, are important streams of political and intellectual work that should be more entwined than placed in opposition. What I am building toward in my current research is precisely a vision of where the twains meet. In this paper, I argue for an approach to racialization in Peru as a series of intertextualizations of the self within a colonial matrix, as Santa Cruz herself theorizes in her poem. John Jackson has written that it is easy, that, quote, it is easy enough to proclaim that social identities are, quote, articulated categories, to repeat ad nauseum that they are all mutually constitutive and just about impossible to practically disentangle. However, he continues, it is quite another thing to construct a social scientific research project that aptly demonstrates the significance of such ineluctable imbrications, unquote. When describing the racial landscape of our ethnographic sites, we anthropologists sometimes assess racial categories lifted from our own observations, as well as the perceptions of other interlocutors and what they say about the said categories. But such sorting sometimes implies highly homogeneous experiences of racialization among individuals, attributed racial categorization in the case of Latin America, indígena, negro, blanco, mestizo, etc. I would suggest, at least in Latin America, that we move away from bodies, as others have recently, as immediate and inequivocal icons, but also move away from relying too heavily on assumptions surrounding structure that deny subjects their agency. Structure can sometimes become extremely abstract, far-reaching, and paralyzing in its Foucauldian implications. As Weismantel, Swinehart, Canessa, and others have explained, race in the Andes specifically is ambiguous, malleable, and even, quote, chameleonic. De la Cadena states that mestizaje, the admixture of racial groups in Latin America in the 1920s, became more about acculturation, about a culture, quote unquote, defined as customs and practices of socialization, more so than about physical features. Paredes shows that even perceptions of individuals' own skin tone do not match the purported racial schematics they use to sort other people around them. So they will call somebody else they have like a color swatch, set of color swatches, and they would match somebody else's race to theirs, but then they would categorize themselves differently using the same color swatch. Demonstrating a more criollo or Hispanicized identity has had to do often with success within a community, running a business where one would interact with urban elites, and of course, wearing the proper fashions in keeping with strict hygienic routines. To this day, speech, more explicitly the performance of monolingual Spanish identities and Spanish forms free of indigenous phonemic features, can mean everything from a promotion at work to safety on public transit. This has yielded difficult social dynamics in the experiences of first and second generation highland migrants to the city of Lima. In anti-indigenous discourse, performing mestizones became a way to raise one's own status, a purported form of self-improvement that incorporated the values and behaviors of, quote, cultured folks, in other words, ideally white Europeans. While we know that racial categories are part and parcel of Latin America in the modern era, understanding colonial regimes allows for a position in analyses of contemporary coloniality. The dominant hierarchy during the 300 years of Spanish colonization produced myriad modes of decoding and performing race, although ironically, race was conceived, and still is, as an intrinsic characteristic of the self. De la Cadena has also clarified the term Indio, for example, initially had less of an ethnic signification and much more a religious one. Dueñas traces the effort of 17th and 18th century indigenous Andean intellectuals seeking to liken themselves to pre-Christian European peoples to divorce themselves from any similarity to enslaved African populations, seeking recognition as intellectual equals to the colonizers in hopes of being admitted into the priesthood and thus achieve upward class mobility. Historian Tamara Walker discusses a court case from 1741 in which Joseph de Ipinza was taken before the Audiencia de Chile, a viceroyal judicial court, because his wife sought an annulment after becoming suspicious that he might be a Chino, a mestizo with a significant degree of African or indigenous blood. Dress, speech, and comportment were brought up as evidence. De Ipinza's poor reputation became central to establishing his race. In a very similar case in 1784, Don Teodoro Jaramillo was accused by his father-in-law before the Audiencia de Quito soon after Teodoro's wedding to the plaintiff's daughter, Baltasara. The plaintiff claimed that by coming into some money and falsely performing high caste, Jaramillo had practiced elaborate racial deception. The court summary shows that the defense brought up the fact that the last name Jaramillo was shared by some low Spanish nobleman, so Teodoro could possibly not be Indio after all. Witnesses explained how Teodoro's mother had never been seen in plebeian clothing, and that his uncle had married a free mulata. And all of these quite extraneous signs were used as solid means to establish Don Teodoro's race. Certainly, not everyone had as much access to the kind of racial fluidity that De Pinza and Teodoro Jaramillo had, but by the end of the colonial period, a large quantity of the population living in Lima and the large cities of the Viceroyalty of Peru were suspected, if not confirmed, of being mixed race. Further, as Walker explains, people's recorded racial designations established by legal proceedings, quote, were not fixed labels. They could change over time, such that a man listed in his marriage certificate as Negro de Casta Congo would appear years later in military records without any racial classification whatsoever. They could even change or be contested in the pages of a single document. Thus, even free mixed race Black individuals in the Andean colonies could be recorded differently using multivariate forms of categorization, each one shade different from the other, by different legal administrators based upon said administrators' biases and the individual's behavior and reputation. Citing Joanne Rappaport's The Disappearing Mestizo, Walker goes on, quote, men and women who found themselves accused of omitting or disguising their racial origins were often, in fact, not passing for anyone but themselves. Rather than engaging in intentional acts of deception, they were instead simply navigating their sociocultural environments to the best of their understandings and abilities. The careful labor of these scholars clarifies that colonial Latin American subjects' own racial belonging was complicated, perhaps conflicted, and not entirely one-directional. The Spanish colonial racial regime, its hierarchy and structure, indeed forced constraints upon individuals' movements and possibilities through multiple forms of violence. But it did not impede racialized individuals from moving through the minefield of colonial society as best they could, something that historian Herman Bennett has written about extensively in his work on the lives of enslaved people in Latin America. So now we can think about the contemporary moment. A child of two immigrant parents, one from the Amazon rainforest in the state of San Martin and one from the coastal area of Ica, Mora, a 38-year-old Limeña interlocutor and close friend of mine, has been working as an artist for most of her adult life, supplementing her income by working in food service and working as a part-time manager and hostess for a high-end restaurant in the tourist neighborhood of Miraflores. Her access to this particular neighborhood is partially due to what she recognizes as her, quote, privileges, racializing forms of social capital, opportunities begotten from material capital based upon her middle-class upbringing, which have shaped her speech, her body aesthetics, sartorial savvy, among other signs. She has been living and working in Barranco, another gentrifying neighborhood for the larger part of her adult life, a neighborhood whose artistic past goes back decades. She's lived in small apartments, sometimes with multiple roommates, sometimes more than 4 roommates. And she comes from no kind of fortune, nor is she interested in acquiring one. Most of her income has always gone to rent. During a conversation we had with 2 other interlocutors of mine, including her best friend Angie, Mora was humorously called out as blanqueada or whitened, because according to her friend Angie, Mora presented herself like a pituca, an upper class, urban, snobbish characterological figure. Part of this performance comes from her variety of Lima speech, and I had a whole thing, but I'll just kind of try and do it. There's a meme about it, and there's 2 main components to it. One is the prosody, so the pitch goes like this. So, ¿qué pasa? And it's also a gendered form. It's feminized. And there's also the velarization of the sibilant. So instead of saying in certain environments, so instead of saying, the most common one is before the consonant C. So instead of saying que buscas or que asco, the production is que asco and que buscas. And so she produces these forms, even though she is not herself. She doesn't come from a wealthy family per se, but she was around these families because of the neighborhood she was in, she grew up in. And her parents are both immigrants. There's a funny meme that I can't show you right now, but just know that there was a funny meme involving the word huevona, which is sort of saying like, bitch, which is a term of endearment also that circulates in this particular register. However, one of the earliest times Mora remembers having to contend with the issue of race occurred to her in her early teen years when she lost a neighborhood friend she had grown up with. The neighbor and her boyfriend managed to get a few other girls in Mora's neighborhood to refer to her and her older sister as Las Negras de Street, a reparticularization of US ascriptions of urban danger received from US media objects from the 1990s, as well as its own colonial forbearance. One day, Mora returned from school to find the racist phrase spray painted onto a wall down the block from her home. Shaken, she told me, she told her parents about the incident and the change in her former friend's attitude. Yet neither Mora nor her father denied blackness to mitigate her bully's attacks, nor deployed mestizaje as a lightening corrective to their racism. Mora's father simply firmly demanded an apology for the obvious attempt to marginalize her daughter, full stop. Mora gave me a phenotypic description of her aunts, her father's sisters, whom she described as having long, curly black hair and dark skin. This, she assumes, indexes her parental side's Afro-Peruvian descent. But Mora herself has never described herself as Afro-descendant. There's a seeming contradiction in her description of herself, physically as China Negra by phenotype, but Indígena by race. She exhibits highly complex modes of engaging with race, as do many of my interlocutors. And she explains that she sees herself as indigenous because of how she looks, but also because her grandmother is from Puno in the southern Peruvian Andes and was an indigenous woman. And she has these stories from her grandmother about their heritage in that sense. So from the Afro-Peruvian side, there's no, well, she assumes that they're Afro-Peruvian because how she looks, but she has no proof of it and they never talk about it. It's never been available to her, even though other people have racialized her as Black. But she also sees her indigeneity as part of a larger political project. So I would have predicted this, but she basically says, it's an idea of the world. It's, quote, an idea of the world, a link to the land. I think that they have the right that their home, their land be respected. They have a knowledge that we don't have. I share the vision that they have, and even though I'm from the city, but it is a personal decision, and just as they feel close to the environment and live in and with nature, I find it much more logical that they would defend their land. I mean, we should not be taking advantage of their land. And you can't see it, but I do like it's a really beautiful metricalization of the use of pronouns where it begins, at the center is yo or I, and then around it, there's layers of distance in this particular piece of the conversation where the third person appears more distant, and then when it becomes when she's using the second person, she's talking about the urban spaces. She's trying to create this link between herself and these indigenous folks, even though she knows they're not the same. Yeah, it was like color coded and stuff. Well, whatever. But the point being that she has this conflicted relationship to indigeneity where she doesn't want to speak for indigenous people. She doesn't claim to have the same experience as folks who have grown up in the highlands like her grandmother, but she does claim that she has a relationship that is more than genealogical, that is more than phenotypic, that is also very much political, and that she is interested in pursuing this political sense of self through multiple different kinds of activities that she's involved in: activism, theater, etc. So while having experienced anti-Black racism like Santa Cruz, having been called negra, Mora is not always perceived as Black. While having rural indigenous grandparents, her performance of class provides her with the clout that whiteifies her, allowing her entry into some of the more discriminatory spaces of the city, such as the restaurant where she works. During the time I spent with Mora prior to 2017, I never once inquired about how she identified racially. But in my future research into race is therefore as much an intervention into ethnographic practice as into theories of racialization. So why did I never ask her this question, right? And often when we think of mestizos in Latin America, we just throw them all into the same category. Oh, they're all mestizos, right? But each individual person, because of the system of racialization, has a different experience of race. And if we think, as many people recently have written, that racialization, racism is a system, we should move away from the iconicity of bodies per our own perception and instead glean from people's experiences how they theorize race, because this theory of race is one that Santa Cruz, as much as Mora, is engaging in. And when you ask people, they develop their own theory of race. And just to end, Rosa and Diaz, citing Hesse, explain that racialization is both institutional and interactional. By repoliticizing racialized identities by people like Mora, as people like Mora do, there is a re-intextualization of racial categories by second-generation migrants in Lima. Thus, it is not only an ethnographic imperative to pay attention to the modes of encoding and decoding race and a focus on perception as a site for arresting racism, but also a call to attend to the agentive capacities of racialized people themselves to activate individual political potential toward collective action, becoming encoders, intextualizers, or promoters, as we heard about in Virginia Zavala's talk earlier, right? As they attempt to effect new enregisterments of indigenous iconic indexicals toward a wider contestation of the colonial white supremacist relegation of indigeneity as inherently inferior. Thank you. So Briana is gonna do it all on Zoom. Yeah. So Briana, can you hear us? Yeah, thanks everybody.
I can. Can you guys hear me and see the screen?
Yes, thank you. So up next we have Briana Nichols and her paper, Ser Libres, the political formation of indigenous youth in the wake of migration.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Briana Nichols. I'm so sorry I cannot be there with you today in person, but I'm honored to be able to present on this panel virtually. And I want to thanks in advance to my intrepid co-organizer, Diego, and to Adrienne, our discussant, and the rest of the panelists. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper titled Ser Libres, the political formation of indigenous youth in the wake of migration. And let's see if I can, there we go. This project emerges out of concerns generated by the crisis of youth migration, which, at least in the eyes of the US public, began in the summer of 2014. Since then, Guatemala has emerged as one of the top countries of origin for migrants crossing the US southern border. The majority of migrants from Guatemala originate from indigenous communities in the Northwest Highlands, and that's where my research is situated. So for Guatemalan indigenous communities, there's a common experience of high levels of food insecurity related to the growing effects of climate change, and the impact of successive natural disasters, in addition to dealing with government corruption, political violence, and a recent rise in organized street gang activity and everyday violence. So despite these conditions which propel forced migration, there are many indigenous young people who are actively striving to avoid migration and remain in their communities, regardless of these challenging conditions. So this paper is integrating three frameworks, one of critical Latinx indigeneities with research on mobilities and linguistic anthropology. Blackwell et al. In 2017 proposed an analytic framework of critical Latinx indigeneities as a re-examination of how the category of Latinidad erases racial structures and multiple colonial forces shaping the exclusion of indigenous migrants across borders. And informed by this framework, I'm considering the experiences of indigenous youth living in contexts of extensive migration and exploring how some of these young people actively fight to remain in their communities of origin, despite the various factors that have forced their peers to do otherwise. I also work within a mobilities paradigm in order to understand the co-constitutive nature of mobility and immobility, as well as to think through the relationship between mobilities and imaginaries, and the ways in which this relationship maps onto inherently temporal considerations of progress and modernity. Salazar refers to this temporal alignment towards progress as a colonial imaginary, embedded in most contexts of migration, which imagines mobility in terms of colonially rooted notions of progress, like cultural cosmopolitanism and certain types of economic progress. So drawing from linguistic anthropology, I use methods of discourse analysis to examine how migration discourse becomes a key site for young people to challenge transnational migration as an opportunity. Building on the work of Bakhtin, Blomert, Silverstein, amongst others, I use the concept of chronotopes as invocable histories to demonstrate how specific configurations of time, space, and subjectivity are enacted through migration discourse. The colonial imaginary mentioned above shows up in migration discourse in what Hilary Dick refers to as the modernist chronotope, or it's a chronotope that pits progress against tradition, producing images of space-time grafted onto social persona. And my work considers what it might mean to attend to a counter-imaginary, a chronotopic formulation that complicates notions of what progress is and how it's understood through the values of neoliberalism and late capitalism. I argue that through their migration discourse, youth invoke contrasting chronotopes to contest the taken for granted logics of migration in three primary ways. So first, in their construction of spatiotemporal evaluations of life there in the United States that present their migrating loved ones as stuck in a repetitive loop of times and spaces that are not their own. Second, by drawing on alternate possible temporalities of here within their community that challenge normative timeframes of success. And third, through reported speech embedded in their migration discourse, which socially position actors. So in exploring how youth engage in migration discourse to make meaning around their non-migratory desires, I illuminate how migration discourse becomes a key site by which Indigenous youth express their political subjectivities in relation to local and geopolitical contexts. Through their discursive renderings of the migrant experience, the young people I work with construct a notion of ser libre, to be free, a conceptualization of freedom which ruptures the spatiotemporal expectations of material success often associated with transnational migration, advocating instead for survivance, in which a good life can be constructed if one accepts divergent timescales and spatial mobilities. So I want to begin my methods section with a quick introduction to the community where I work. This is a Mam Indigenous community, which I call Namtokyol, and it's in the Northwest Highlands of Guatemala. About 18,000 community members, 30% of whom at any given time are actually living in the United States. And as such, Namtokyol is a community experiencing extensive migration. And within Namtokyol, unsurprisingly, there are widely circulating narratives of the American dream and idealized notions of the US nation state. However, there are also counter-narratives, stories of the United States not as the land of opportunity and refuge, but as a site of degradation and humiliation and a place where Indigenous Guatemalans cannot live with dignity. The data I'm presenting today comes from my larger ethnographic project, which included 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork in the United States and Guatemala. Pertinent to this talk is my ethnographic engagement with a group of Indigenous youth in Namtokyol, with whom I conducted a 14-week collaborative seminar. And the discourse excerpts I'm presenting today come from some of the 54 open-ended interviews I conducted with community youth. I analyzed the stories my youth interlocutors told during their interviews as a form of discursive practice, interactional events through which speech participants enact and solidify their social cultural identities. So today, I'm going to present 3 excerpts from one of the open-ended interviews I conducted, with Irene, who you can actually see sitting in the middle of this picture between 2 of our colegas. Irene was in her early 20s when we met, unpartnered, and only one of her parents' 2 children living at home. Both Irene's father and her older brother had migrated to the United States. And according to Irene, her father's migration was to support the family economically, and her older brother followed a few years after he did. When I walked into her house, we passed through a central courtyard into the kitchen where Irene invited me to sit down at a small table, and her mother offered us pan dulce and some coffee to drink, at which point I began the interview, asking Irene about her childhood and her family. She talked initially about the impact of her father's migration, but then pretty quickly switched to her brother, who was currently living in the United States. She spoke of how much she missed him and how his migration had actually shaped her life. And she explained that it was through communication with her brother that she began to question the logics of migration and reevaluate the system that those logics were part of. So in this first excerpt, this is Irene talking about what her brother told her about migration. So she says, that life there is not easy. There one is not free. They pay you the minimum salary, all because you don't have papers. You can't speak English well. They have you do whatever the hell they want. In other words, pardon the expression, but that's how it is. Irene begins this instance of migration discourse by invoking an imaginary of life there in line 1. And through her use of the informal you, she locates both herself and her audience, in this case, me, within this imaginary space-time of the United States while never explicitly mentioning the US. In this discourse segment, she presents general truths about life for undocumented migrants, as in it's not easy, and brings up the notion of being free for the first time by noting that there, one is not free. The statements which follow this idea of freedom explain how freedom is denied, helping us understand how Irene is conceptualizing not being free, for example, being paid poorly while having to do whatever work people can imagine for you, and conversely, what it might mean to be free. Irene aligns herself with the experiences of the persona of an undocumented migrant as compared to the they who hire undocumented migrants to do their work. Her description of life there draw on a timeless interaction between the figure of the undocumented migrant and the figure of the legal resident or citizen to present a general truth about the life one might lead in the United States. So this next excerpt follows directly from the first. And here, Irene is actually voicing her brother talking about what people say to him in the United States. So it says, here you can't say no because they say to you, all these immigrants, what are you doing here? You should be in your country. You should not be here. If you want the job, it's yours. And if not, forget about it. And he said to me, here one comes to humiliate themselves. Don't believe that life is easy. Don't believe that here they come in, welcome. No, here they humiliate you. Here they put you down. Here they let you know that you are not from here and that you come here. And they do an endless number of things, which people don't understand the reason why one comes here. So in this excerpt, Irene's use of reported speech has multiple layers. Irene voices her brother's words in lines 1, 5 through 6, and 8 through 13, but she also voices her brother reporting the general statements that they say to you in lines 2 through 4 and 7. Irene also invokes the spatial deictics acá and aquí, which is a here, kind of proximate here, as well as allí and allí, which is a there, and she's using it in a precise term to reference Nam Tokyo, the community where they live. And in the next excerpt, you're going to see her also use allá, which is there imprecise, and it's used when Irene is reflecting on the United States. So the use of reported speech in migration discourse was a really common pattern across the young people I worked with. None of my youth interlocutors had themselves migrated. And in fact, I argue that their migration discourse is constructed specifically to justify their non-migratory aspirations in a context where migration often seems like common sense. Thus, the reported speech they draw on are the utterances of their loved ones who either have migrated and since returned or who continue to live in the United States. This reported speech, like the above discourse segment, helps position youth as knowledgeable actors in their non-migratory aspirations. While they themselves do not have firsthand experience living in the United States, in reported speech, the position they inhabit is the voices of those who do have firsthand experiences, and whose reports of life there directly contradict the modernist chronotope, which spatiotemporally positions the United States as a place of future opportunity. So moving on to the third excerpt, Irene begins to reflect on her brother's representations of the United States, as well as the advice her brother gives her. So she starts again by reporting her brother's speech. No, stay there. I know that you can get ahead there. Maybe I didn't have that opportunity, but I want to give it to you. Do not lose hope. More can be achieved there. I think that with education, I think that there one can get ahead or have better opportunities. For however difficult it is, I know it's possible. I began to analyze it and I said, he is right. Here, maybe with little or enough that we have, or how we live, we are free. Here, no one can come and say, it's that you are this. Look, you are this. No, here we are proud of our roots. So in excerpts 2 and 3, Irene begins the work of invoking contrasting chronotopes through her reported speech and use of indexicals. She constructs spatiotemporal representations of life there and life here, both of which are positioned implicitly against a contrastive chronotope of there as modernity and opportunity. Thus, in this discourse, we actually have 3 chronotopic formulations: the widely circulating modernist chronotope of life there as opportunity and advancement, the chronotope invoked by my youth interlocutors of a there that is defined not by opportunity and advancement, but by humiliation, degradation, and a lack of freedom, and the corollary spatiotemporal representation of here within the community, where freedom is possible despite the difficulties of achieving economic advancement because community members are not defined by external actors and can be proud of their roots. So after her brother explains what life is like in the United States, She shifts into reporting his advice to her. And it is in this moment where Irene begins to co-construct with her brother an alternate spatiotemporality of success. Instead of getting ahead here or there in the US, Irene reports her brother as believing she can get ahead in Nam-Tokyo. Specifically, she voices him as saying, do not lose hope, more can be achieved there. I think that with education, I think that there one can get ahead, etc. This is a chronotypic formulation of there in Nam-Tokyo that contradicts both the scope of possibility and temporality of possibility that's commonly assumed for the community. Through her brother's reported speech, Irene stresses the conditions for getting ahead, not losing hope, receiving an education, that it's going to be difficult, and creates a contrast with the circulating imaginaries of getting ahead in the United States, that it's grounded in economic advancement through labor or it occurs over a quick time frame. Irene again invokes a conceptualization of freedom, saying here, maybe with little or enough we have or how we live, we are free. She's provided some examples of what it was not to be free earlier in this conversation, and here she connects freedom with a spatiotemporal representation of Nam-Tokyo, which is fundamentally distinct from that of the United States. As opposed to the capitalist accumulation that is associated with the American dream, Irene references the little or enough we have as connected to how we live, which is a life in which we are free. Who the we is becomes clearer as she continues, saying that here we are proud of our roots, and that thus the here, Nam-Tokyo, is a place where outsiders don't have the capacity to define you. She leaves unspoken the implicit comparison to there, the United States. So given that Nam-Tokyo is a Mam Indigenous community, Irene referencing the ability for self-determination and being proud of their roots takes on particular significance. Interpreted through the lens of critical Latinx indigeneities, Irene is creating a commentary not just on the treatment of undocumented migrants in the United States, generally speaking, but on the specific experiences of people from her community who are Mam Indigenous Guatemalan. Through these competing spatiotemporal representations of here and there, being free is detached from the idea of success through migration, and instead anchored in the ability for community members to be proud of their roots, define themselves, and have the right of refusal. This conceptualization of freedom ruptures the spatiotemporal expectations of material success often associated with transnational migration, advocating instead for survivance in which a good life can be constructed if one accepts divergent timescales and spatial mobilities. So, to conclude, how do we understand Irene's discursive practices during this interview? Discursive practices which were replicated across my engagements with youth as they, like Irene, invoked the voices of their migrating loved ones in order to evaluate transnational migration as a future-making technique. I argue that through their migration discourse, young people engaged in stance-taking regarding the promise of transnational migration. And in part, this was accomplished through their use of contrasting chronotopes, one which positions life there in the United States as defined by a lack of physical mobility and temporal liberty, and the other which contrasts narratives of success here in Nam-Tokyo by challenging the normative timeframes and metrics of future aspirations. For young people who have themselves never migrated, their use of reported speech allowed them to occupy the subject position of knowledgeable diasporic actors whose non-migratory aspirations were informed by a rejection of dominant discourses of modernity and progress, as well as a reconceptualization of what it means to be free, that prioritizes their lives within their communities over the economic possibilities of transnational migration. I contend that given what it means to be Indigenous in both Guatemala and the United States, this is an inherently political stance. These Indigenous youth are drawing on diasporic knowledge to reclaim their rootedness within their own communities, despite widespread assumptions that they live in communities that are without futures. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Briana. Our next speaker is Mena, and his paper is A Language Elsewhere, Producing Governable Racialized Bilingual Subjects.
And how are we doing with the video? We're working on it. just give this a couple minutes, and then if not. Is that good? Oh, it's cute. Oh. Palm trees. Palm trees. Okay. Explain this over here. Alrighty. So, welcome everyone. First off, visuals. Are the visuals out there too? Great. Okay, so the visuals are kind of meant to present like a background music and also kind of a response to what Fox News and Donald Trump always shows about the Rio Grande Valley, which is this perpetual desert that's always building a border wall for some reason. There's grass, there's palm trees, there's people, and there's cars. So that's what this is. Just some background stuff. Background visuals. Okay. So the new title, first off, I'd like to emphasize that the title for this talk has changed since a couple years ago, reflecting where my research is going into the future. The new title is A Soft Linguistic Terrorism, Conceptualizing the Language Elsewhere. So for a few years, I've been conducting research at this self-purported English-Spanish bilingual university in South Texas, deep South Texas borderlands, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, opened in 2015. Now, after talking with some faculty, some students, I noticed that the idea of standard Spanish kept coming up. So eventually I just asked people, where does standard Spanish come from? Easy enough. The answer sounded like, well, Spain has pure Spanish, or the people in Puerto Rico, they speak the good Spanish, the sexy Spanish. One of my favorites, my friend from Monterrey, Mexico speaks proper Spanish. In all these conversations, people pointed elsewhere, identifying every Spanish-speaking country in the world except the United States. Always pointing to an elsewhere is actually the feature that made all of these answers very similar. The best Spanish came from far away. The further away, the better. Always from an elsewhere. But there was one answer that I never heard, not once across the dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews. Not one person ever said, oh, you know what? My mom speaks good Spanish, or my dad, or my grandma, or my grandpa, right? The best Spanish is never from home, never from the family, never from South Texas, but always from elsewhere, hence the language elsewhere. So today I'm talking about this linguistic imaginary, the language elsewhere, and how it emerges in everyday life and in this university. As we'll see, the language elsewhere becomes what it needs to be to reproduce social hierarchy. It changes names, it changes features, changes speakers. We are speaking of a Spanish from elsewhere. Some participants called it Spain Spanish. Sometimes it was Mexico Spanish, international Spanish, global Spanish, right? Other times, participants simply located it right outside of the home. Names like high register Spanish, or proper Spanish, or academic Spanish, or high level Spanish. As we'll see, always present is a blunt linguistic dichotomy: standard language versus substandard language, standard speaker versus substandard speaker, standard listener versus substandard listener. The language elsewhere becomes what it needs to be to perpetuate these dichotomies. The idea today is not to treat the language elsewhere as a real object or like a real standard Spanish. Instead, following Angela Reyes, the idea is to conceptualize these linguistic objects as, quote, things made to seem real by wider and longer structural processes that regard them as such. So I want to illustrate how the language elsewhere emerges in everyday talk from 3 different positionalities in this university. 2 students, 1 faculty member, 1 administrator. And as we'll see, each person conceptualizes standard language differently, meaning there is no standardized way people talk about what standard language is. It simply becomes what it needs to be from moment to moment. Yet every version of the standard Spanish, was the same in the way that it was deemed separate from South Texas social life. Specifically, good Spanish comes from elsewhere. Never the home, never the family, never South Texas, never the United States. In fact, let's begin here with geography. First, a quote from a faculty member who grew up in this South Texas region, so he's a hometown boy, like me, by the way. He said, I call it, quote, I call it Mexico City Spanish, but it's like the correct Spanish. I don't know what they call it. Castellano? I think that's what it's called. I don't really remember. Now, in this conversation, the correct Spanish was located in a specific city in Mexico, which this faculty member identifies as possibly Castellano. What's important in a statement like this is to note the widespread ideological belief held by many lifelong regional residents that a good Spanish comes from elsewhere, particularly from Spain and from affluent cities in Mexico. Now, this faculty member reads, writes, speaks, grades papers, and conducts his coursework in English and Spanish, yet he regularly characterizes his own Spanish language comprehension as not good enough, often reporting that he didn't understand his Mexican students, meaning those who crossed the Texas-Mexico border to come to class every day. The language elsewhere becomes what it needs to be to reproduce multiple dichotomies: standard speakers versus substandard speakers, standard listeners versus substandard listeners or comprehenders. Yet the language elsewhere doesn't actually require geography. In fact, it becomes real across many scales. A consistent theme was locating academic Spanish as acquired or learned anywhere else but the homes of South Texas. For example, one student named Miranda described her Spanish-speaking home as the following, quote, my parents would be like, if I don't understand you, if I can't understand you, you speak Spanish. So I feel like that kept us with the oral language. It stayed. And also like the reading language, but it's more social. Like our language is a little bit more social. But now that I'm in school, that's when it's a bit more academic, end quote. So this student shifted the scale of the language elsewhere, creating a dichotomy between the home language and academic language, between social language and between school language, right? Another student named Ramona described her Spanish-speaking home as explicitly speaking, quote, not academic Spanish. But instead, at home, they speak the language of the Mexican. I'll say that again. They speak the language of the Mexican. So this was kind of a joke. We both laughed. We both knew I knew what he meant. However, let's pay attention to the way Spanish was contextually positioned. Spanish becomes part of the home. And as part of the home, Spanish suddenly acquires a racialized body, the body of the Mexican. This indirectly positions academic Spanish as not having a body. And if it doesn't have a body, then it most definitely doesn't have a race either. The language elsewhere becomes what it needs to be. And finally, let's look at one university administrator. Now, this idea of adding academic language to students' linguistic repertoires is a very common pedagogical stance right now, additive bilingualism. Yet I suggest that this traffics the very soft implication that what is brought into the classroom from home is not good enough to become competitive in the marketplace. This administrator said, quote, "I see that you come with your own language, and it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. We just need to work. I'm trying to add to it. I'm trying to expand it. I'm not trying to correct it. I'm not trying to erase it. But at the end of the day, you want students to know that they can graduate and that they can find a job and they'll be more marketable than the monolingual person with the same degree." So in this university, in line with celebrating all things diversity, the home language is often generally framed as culturally enriching and something to be honored. However, I've never heard the home language described as already economically valuable. It's gotta be backed by a university or some sort of certification. So those were four people from three different positionalities, all conceptualizing this same linguistic imaginary quite differently, but also quite the same. The language elsewhere changed names, forms, origins, but it always trafficked dichotomies: standard versus substandard, correct versus incorrect, between having a racialized body and between not having a body, and therefore not having a race. And finally, the dichotomy between an economically valuable language versus a linguistic practice that is simply not good enough. The language elsewhere becomes what it needs to be, and there is absolutely nothing standardized about it. In closing, how does this relate to Gloria Anzaldua's theory of linguistic terrorism? So Anzaldúa attended a university in the same region of South Texas called Pan American College, where she and thousands of others of students were subjected to the speech tests. Mexicans lined up on registration day were told to speak out loud, and then they were funneled into remedial classes to fix their broken English. Their language was not good enough. That experience growing up in the Texas border and attending Pan American College would become central to Anzaldúa's theory of linguistic terrorism, which foregrounded her experience as being a substandard language user. That racist standard-substandard dichotomy that said Mexicans were simply never good enough. So last paragraph. So today, I've been talking about the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, which opened in 2015. It's the second largest Hispanic serving institution in the United States, serves more than 30,000 students, 90% of whom are of Mexican descent. It's a local university attended by the local Rio Grande Valley resident. I was one of them. I went to this university as well. Today, the university loudly markets itself as a bilingual, bicultural, biliterate institution, or a B3 institution, as it likes to call itself. However, before its recent reopening and subsequent rebranding, this was the exact same university that Gloria Anzaldúa attended. This was Pan American College, the same university that had the speech test. So I'm asserting that the standard-substandard dichotomy that Anzaldúa wrote about more than 30 years ago is still alive and well in South Texas, in that same South Texas region, the same university, although renamed and rebranded as a bilingual university. We might say that it's been updated a bit to this dichotomy, however. That's to say, the standard languages have been reframed. The language elsewhere is institutionally constructed as politically neutral, bodiless, as raceless, and as an object of pure economic value, ready for the global marketplace. But ultimately, treating a stigmatized language in this way will not work against racial and linguistic hierarchies. It just won't. On the contrary, valuing a people's language while simultaneously devaluing the people who use it has the potential to be one of the softest forms of linguistic terrorism to date. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys. I'm Mike Mena.
Thank you, Mike. And our last panelists are Miki Makihara and Juan Luis Rodríguez Aponte. And their paper is Indigenous and Diasporic Intimacies in Chile, Political Subjectivity, Stances, and Nationhood.
Oh, what do I do? Oh,
You can leave it up there if you want.
no, I have a. Let's see.
Sorry. Which one are you? This one?
I'm for, but the PPTX for not the. Oh no, I'm sorry. Number 5. Yeah, PPTX. So thank you for coming today. I'm just gonna start already. Yeah. Oh, good. Today we bring together 2 examples from Chile in order to explore how intimacy, power, politics, and diasporic subjectivities are formed, and in particular, how intimacy plays an important role in constructing social relationality and political subjectivity. First, we have indigenous poetry in Rapa Nui that addresses in humorous terms that the disappointment of a young, enchanted modern subject who does not have the means to procure their underwear for themselves. Secondly, we have an immigrant Venezuelan restaurant worker who's fed up with being in Chile and having to learn Chilean expressions and idioms. The worker engages in a loud but jovial rant that amuses his co-workers and the Venezuelan public online, but offends Chileans and ends up being fired from his job. We agree with Davis that diasporic subjectivities characterize indigenous as well as migrants and refugees' life. Davis defines diaspora as peoples who share a common historical experience of displacement, dispossession, and dislocation. This includes for us Rapa Nui people and Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Chile, who have converging histories of diasporic experiences with the nation state. The Rapa Nui have a long history of struggles, dispossession, isolation, and more recently, rising political and indigenous movements. Venezuelans in Chile have a much more recent diasporic history, rapidly becoming the largest immigrant community in the capital city of Santiago. With our 2 examples, we want to investigate how linguistic intimacy creates diasporic political subjectivities and in the process is affected by power. Semiotic intimacy is a sense of mediated closeness, not just with subjects, but with the other semiotic forms that allow them to articulate forms of political agency or responsibility to a power structure. Stances are central to the production of intimacy and can ideologically determine the affective relationship between subjects and semiotic forms, which include subject themselves. Intimacy can create affective indeterminacy during the emergence of political subjectivity, consequently creating different publics. The examples we bring here of verbal performances, rant on one hand and poetry on the other, are both tragicomic. They both have humorous effects on the intimate audiences they address, but at the same time, they describe unfortunate situations and are based on historical displacement. In fact, The kinds of humor we see here depend on and solidify the common or vicarious lived experience of the tragedy and sense of belonging. This is part of the affective indeterminacies that pervades these examples. Indeterminacy, in this sense, is productive because it leaves open-ended different forms of relationality and social boundaries. And we could add, this indeterminacy is potentially political. In this paper, we argue that two converging forms of diasporic intimacy found in Rapa Nui poetry and the Venezuelan workers' rant are characterized by common poetic, political, and sociolinguistic indeterminacies. The two examples allow us to examine ways in which power and politics are articulated through processes of stance-making that produce nationhood. We define stance-making as acts that not only position the subjects in relation to semiotic forms, but create and constitute semiotic forms themselves, and through which political subjectivity is created. Rapa Nui in Chile. So if you would take out the handout, I'm not going to read it for the time, but in this poem, Mata Uiroa Atan illustrates a kind of performative space in which political subjectivity and forms of affect are explored and cultivated. Upon hearing the ship's arrival, the protagonist runs around to where their mother and friends and in search of something they need, a lot of excitement. They can't find it in any closet. Finally, they see one hanging on a guava tree, drying. What could it be? The reader finally learns that it is underwear made of flour sack that they dearly want. How joyful they become at the sight, but as they reach for it, it rips and breaks. They cannot go to the festivity and gathering that is being held for the visitors, and the poem ends with the declaration that the ship has left the island. This tragicomic poem embodies a historical experience of the island community that has been colonized and incorporated into the Chilean national global society and economy since its annexation in 1888. The time referenced in this poem is more specifically around 1960s, when the Chilean Navy ship used to arrive with cargo and people. After the revolt of 1914, led by the Rapa Nui female leader Angata against the Scottish-Chilean exploitation or Easter Island exploitation company, the government conceded to send the ship annually. The islanders were confined to a small area and prohibited to travel away or within the island. In 1953, the Navy took over the sheep ranch. The Rapa Nui later staged a revolution in 1964, and the government responded by granting them civil administration and public services in 1966. Regular air service also in 1971. The central semiotic form in this example is a piece of flour sack underwear, which is being created through an act of stance-making by the poet, who calls attention to it, symbolizing changes in the local patterns of consumption, aesthetics, and sociality. Mata's work gives its audience an imagination about the kinds of social relationship and emerging social contract that Trio characterize as, quote, the confirmation of nationhood, the confirmation of civil society by the state, and the confirmation of sameness and interdependence across class boundaries. At the same time, the poet calls attention to the recrafting of the flour sack's materiality for a purpose it was not intended. The perceived indeterminacy of this material allows Mata to describe the Rapa Nui as transgressive and even funny. They used it to produce the political subjectivity linked to their connection with the emerging nationhood of Chile and the wider global capitalist trade. Having fun with the ephemeral dream of flirting with this underwear in an extended sociality beyond the island is also productive in the cultivation of a subjectivity. What makes this new subjectivity political is the multiple indeterminate transgressive affects that people develop by paying attention to this piece of underwear. People can feel enjoyment, nostalgia, pity, and more by being intimate with this particular sign. This all can result in expansion of Rapa Nui historical consciousness, including through vicarious form of learning.
In the second example that we present today, Venezuelan workers living in Chile started a rant complaining about Chilean Spanish, saying, Dios mío, estoy cansado de esta maldición. My God, I'm fed up with this curse. The curse being Chilean Spanish itself. In the background of the video, we can hear a great deal of laughter and enjoyment among his Venezuelan co-workers in the kitchen, who encouraged him to keep on ranting, throwing examples of Chilean words at him. Tocino, they said, and he corrects tocineta. Zapallo, and he corrects auyama. Choclo, and he corrects jojoto. These are words for bacon, pumpkin, and corn that he is fed up with. These are semiotic forms that catch the attention of the immediate audience and symbolize their diasporic life in Chile. The rapid and constant pace of the call and response and the laughter that they elicit from the Venezuelan workers provoke a moment of intimacy and rejection of Chilean words as appropriate signifiers. The worker is asked by someone in the background, where do you want to be? And he answered, Maracaibo, emphasizing the I, throwing his hands to the air. Maracaibo is a region that is famous in Venezuela for being very proud of their local identity and ways of speaking. Therefore, when he speaks, he emphasizes not only his identity as Venezuelan, but as a Maracucho, a person from Maracaibo. This is more legible, at least to a Venezuelan audience, by his expressive gestures, the cadence of his speech, and his lexical choices for curse words, such as mardito, in which the alveolar flap substitutes the lateral approximant that is more common, in other variants of Venezuelan Spanish. The worker then creates a form of regional Venezuelan intimacy by his feelingful attachment to linguistic forms that are recognizable for Venezuelans in one way and Chileans in another. This video has been criticized online by Chileans and by some Venezuelans as disrespectful to Chile. The basis for this criticism is that this Venezuelan, who has found a new home in Chile, is not willing to assimilate to very basic everyday things like calling chicken with mayonnaise ave mayo, as Chileans do. Venezuelans have come to the defense of this worker, arguing that Chileans don't understand how comical and regionally specific the video is. They don't get how funny Maracuchos are. Nevertheless, the public criticism at the end outweighs the possible defense of the worker who ended up being fired from his job. What this event tells us about the position of Venezuelans as political subjects in Chile is that the newness of the diasporic situation for many Venezuelans, unlike for many Rapa Nui, who have been diasporic subjects in Chile for a long time, is still producing ambivalences that they have to embrace as an everyday semiotic means to becoming Chilean or part of Chile. For the very possibility of creating links with Venezuelan specific, not just with Venezuela, but with Venezuelan specific semiotic forms, which are not enough to ensure that these diasporic subjects can carve a space within a country that is in the middle of profound political transformations. Right now, they are rewriting the constitution after a social uprising, and they just elected and inaugurated a very young progressive new president. So, as final thoughts in conclusion, right? We foreground through this paper political transgressive subjectivity formation in our examples and how they are influenced by forms of power. The way we have presented this relationship is not one of exclusivity, but dialogical interaction between agentive forces, power and politics in this case. In the Rapa Nui example, the making of underwear out of flour sack cloth is an activity that doesn't have an explicit political purpose. Nevertheless, when a Rapa Nui speaking poet pays attention to it, it makes it possible for people to see this piece of cloth as a semiotic form that can be transgressive and political in an intimate way, funny and sad at the same time, a real and vicarious form of nation building. In the Venezuelan case, the political transgressive form of the speech is more apparent. This worker, feeling full connection with his regional Venezuelan ways of speaking, rubs against Chilean senses of righteousness and Venezuelan senses of appropriateness. This is more squarely what Herzfeld describes as cultural intimacy. The political subjectivities of both Rapa Nui and Venezuelan migrants in Chile are both diasporic in the sense that they are both developed in a situation of dispossession, displacement, and exclusion from a national center they are both forced to embrace. These two subjects are supposed to want to become Chilean, not doing so or not doing so in the right way, and even making fun of that process is a political transgressive stance-making. By this, we mean that these political positions compel both Rapa Nui and Venezuelans to construct Chile in ways that are intimate for themselves, yet strange, self-righteous, just strange for Chileans, and self-righteous, ignorant, and offensive for some publics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan and Miki. And now, final remarks from our discussant, Adrienne Lowe.
All right, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for sticking with us. I don't know about you, but I feel like I not only got out of shape during the pandemic, but I lost my conference stamina. The fact that I'm supposed to be smart and vertical for 3 days in a row, I can't do it anymore. I'm just oh my God, I can't do it anymore. So that's the space that I'm coming from right now. So I don't know if y'all are feeling that. That's what I'm feeling. So my discussion comments are going to be short. That's my goal today, shortness. Okay. So first of all, I'd really like to thank the session organizers, Diego and Briana, for their generous invitation to comment on this excellent group of papers and for sticking with us for, I think, 3 years. And I'm going to comment only on the 4 papers that we got because it turns out that people's email addresses changed from 2019 to 2022, and we kind of didn't realize this with Sara. So I apologize for that. Okay. And what I'd like to focus on is what Ling Ants specifically might contribute to the study of race and racialization. So, one of the more difficult issues to deal with in our work is the relationship that people have to the frameworks of personhood that they live with every day. I may know, as a scholar, that race is a historical construct and that racialization is historically variable and contingent. However, that does not stop me from being enraged every time I hear about one of my kids being accused of shoplifting in Canada or being asked by their school teachers to explain the significance of their unique and meaningful Chinese names. There is a disconnect between my own lived experience, in which race does not feel contingent whatsoever, and what I know as a scholar. So how do we deal with this? How do we value people's own experiences and understandings of the world while pointing out the ways in which these understandings are framed by and serve the interests of power? While sociologists that I read still seem to unproblematically invoke Rogers Brubaker's admonition to separate categories of practice from categories of analysis, this is a difficult stance for anthropologists to take, particularly in these decolonizing times. When I teach Jane Hill's work to undergraduates these days, I find myself taking pains to point out that the rhetoric of distance knowledge as superior to intimate knowledge is part of the colonial apparatus of our discipline, one that I am, of course, part of as well. So in that vein, I think that we, as linguistic anthropologists, can contribute to current discussions of race by underscoring the ways that narratives of the self are socially and historically produced. We are in a moment now in which the genre of the self-disclosing narrative is understood as an incredibly important and salient and necessary political act. So how to produce these narratives, how to receive them, has become a really important form of sociolinguistic competency, right? So under the semiotic regime, in which what you say is who you are, it is easy to lose sight of the ways that this is not the only way to understand what speech is, or the relationship of the self to our words, as Summerson Carr has so brilliantly analyzed in her discussion of inner reference. How can we think about conformity to genre in a regime in which what I say is understood as, quote, my truth? How do we reconcile the patterned commensurability of a collection of narratives across time with the notion of agency or the individual subject? I think that Briana Nichols' excellent paper shows us ways of thinking through these questions. That is, perhaps structure versus agency is not the best way to conceptualize this problem, given the ways that it frames agency in terms of the actions of the individual liberal subject and elides the workings of power. Maybe the key contribution of linguistic anthropology in this vein is the concept of the interrelatedness of genre, as Nichols' paper so insightfully demonstrates. Her work elucidates how people make sense of the kinds of dichotomizing modernist genres of narrativizing space-time that seem so ubiquitous. And we saw these same modernist narratives, I think, across every single paper, right? The kind of metropole-colony dichotomy. While these genres may acquire a powerful force through the ways that they circulate, both in metropoles and in post-colonies, we also need to pay attention to how they get taken up, reframed, and reworked, as her paper shows. But one question that I have for her is whether to think about the ways, so I really appreciate her attention to the ways that, not moving is also really important and is an act, right? It's not just like moving is an act. But one question that I have for her is whether to think of the ways that people talk about not moving, whether we should think of that as a counter discourse to understandings of mobility and stasis, or whether it's actually just part of that whole complex, the same thing, right? And here I'm thinking of sociologist Nandita Sharma's really great book, Home Rule. So in that book, she examines the constitution of the figure of the migrant, right? So from the perspective of the metropole, the migrant is someone who's out of place and will always be an outsider and has no rights to land or belonging, right? And she talks about the mutual constitution of the figures of this rooted native, right, who has sort of claims to land and authenticity, and the migrant who is just mobile in all the wrong ways. So she says that the constitution of these two figures feeds into a discourse of authenticity that in the end just really serves the interests of capital, because capital can move everywhere, capital can make labor move everywhere, but this is part of how they keep us docile to them. In this regard, the narratives of rootedness, of staying, that Briana analyzes, are they drawing upon this valorization of rootedness and stasis? And this is a formulation that Sharma argues is part of the technology of empire. So I'm asking whether they are countering the dominant narrative, are they a counter discourse? Or maybe they're actually co-constituting it, right? Because the valorization of stasis is part of the devalorization of moving. Modernist and colonialist narratives of space-time also play an important role in Mena's rich paper. And there we saw the relations of metropole colony get projected on these chronotopes of South Texas versus it seemed anywhere else, right? So South Texas occupies the pole, is aligned with the pole of the colony. Mexico City, Madrid, Puerto Rico, anywhere else, right? Occupies the space of the metropole, right, in those narratives. And we see in his work a second important contribution that a linguistic anthropological approach can make to the study of race, which is to excavate the ways in which these kind of particular enregistered languages get linked and delinked from figures, right? So I'm pushing you a little bit on the analysis of the idea that maybe standard Spanish doesn't have a body and doesn't have a race, right? So it seems to me that at times, your interlocutors reprise the vision of the standard as being anonymous, right? So the standard comes from anytime, any place, right? It's not linked to anything, and this is what Kit Willard has talked about, right, in her discussion of standard language ideology. But it seemed to me that on a lot of the data, the participants are mapping standard versus vernacular registers of Spanish onto contrastive figurations. So there's the successful job seeker, the unsuccessful one. There's the cosmopolitan language prof who can move anywhere, anytime. They can just come from Lima to Texas, and they're no problem. Versus the person, the local, whose mobility is constrained because they don't have the right Spanish, right? There's that narrative about the kid of poverty versus the professor of today, right? I mean, those are figured and classed and whatever, specified in a lot of different ways. So my question for you is, when do these linkages surface and when do they recede? And I wasn't entirely sure whether your argument was that the images of standard language are in actuality not linked to figures, or if they're instead misrecognized as not indexically specifying, like Bourdieu might argue. Okay, almost done. Building on the theme of indexicality, I would like now to turn to Arispe-Bazán, Diego's excellent paper. His work illustrates how careful consideration of ideologies about indexicality are key to unpacking understandings of race, right? So, for example, one key issue that he brings up is how terms that are understood under referentialist ideology to refer exclusively to race can be resignified. And we saw this in the kind of beautiful opening vignette about negra, right? That it is a racial term, but then comes to encompass all these other things, political stances, whatever, all kinds of stuff. So I would like to zero in here on the term racial malleability, which seems like it's being used by these historians and other people that you cite to talk about two, it seems to me like different phenomena, right? So the first phenomena that I saw was that it's being used to talk about ways that terms registered as racial ones come to accrue meanings beyond those conventionally assigned to race. So that's the first one. And then the second aspect of this thing we're calling racial malleability, is about the conditions under which it becomes notable that people move between categories of personhood, okay, indexically. So regarding the first point, all right, so I caught a cab with a bunch of people from the airport, and as we were driving into town, someone was like, oh my God, that's so Boulder. And they pointed to a car in front of us, and it had like this big wraparound advertisement, and it was like, natural burials, be buried naturally, don't we, right? So we're like, oh yeah, so Boulder, right? So we're driving into town, and we suddenly start making all these commensurations about like what else is so Boulder, right? It's like, oh yeah, there's the hipster mailman, there's like fleece everywhere, there's like the healthy glow everyone has here, because they look like they hike all the time, there's all that comfort footwear, right? So we started doing this like so Boulder moment, okay. So I bring up this banal example, okay, to point out that this expansion of a term for, quote, place, Boulder, right, to encompass an imagined figure that we were typifying with clothing, class, consumption patterns, et cetera, seems like totally unremarkable to us, right, because that's what we were doing. Okay, and yet when these same processes of indexical saturation happen with terms registered as, quote, racial, they become alarming or surprising, right? So we're like, oh, these racial terms, they point to figures that are also typified in terms of employment, religion, residence, class, demeanor, et cetera, right? So my question is, when people write about this thing they're calling racial malleability, could we analyze these in relation to referentialist and indexical understandings of how words come to have meaning? So maybe these aren't discourses about bodies, they're discourses about words. And what I'm thinking about here is what produces, quote, malleability in this first sense is not that race, quote, race shifts from bodies to religion, but that terms like indígena do not narrowly point exclusively to race under a referentialist understanding of how word meaning should stay fixed, right? And here we see the like creeping hand of liberalism, right? So it's like the racial terms, they move, they shift, they mean these other things, right? Gene abusive words, all that stuff, right? We need to rectify the language, like they're the ones that aren't supposed to move, right? And other kinds of terms can accrue these other meanings and it doesn't produce anxiety in us, right? Or it doesn't seem like, as racial malleability suddenly happening, whatever that is, right? Okay, the second phenomenon that's getting glossed as, quote, malleability is one where various participants are positioned or position themselves as inhabitants of categories that are understood to be mutually incompatible, right? So this is the like, I'm indígena, but I'm negra, but I'm, whatever, right? So my question here is on what timescales is this possible, and when does this become notable, right? Because on the one hand, the fact that we orient to different categories of personhood over time is like 100% normal, right? I'm not the same person at 6 a.m. than I am like at 4 p.m. I'm not the same person like here than I am in Canada, because in Canada I would be like passed out on my couch at this point, like, in my sweatpants, I would not be vertical anymore. So when does this kind of move? I mean, this is like just normal everyday stuff, right? Like we're different, whatever, different people, different kinds, all this stuff. So when does this kind of movement that Diego's paper examines, such as that between indígena and negra, become notable, and when does it not? Is this something that can happen on the timescale of a sentence? Is it okay if it happens on the timescale of a lifetime? Because we think that's okay if it happens on the timescale of a lifetime with regard to class, right? I can move from category A to category B, no one's problem with that. What about the day or a generation, or is it just like it's never okay? I'm just wondering when this becomes a notable phenomenon. Okay, one last way that indexicality comes into focus can be seen in Juan Rodríguez and Miki Makihara's excellent paper. And what I love about this piece is that it shows the specific contributions of a semiotic approach to meaning to understanding racialization. So on the one hand, we have the affect-laden performance from Rodríguez's interlocutor, where affect becomes a really key way to talk back to the conditions of dispossession that make migration from Venezuela to Chile necessary. And I really enjoyed this analysis because as they point out in their paper, what makes this anger intimate is also what makes it political, right? So while, it's okay to say these things in the private sphere to your friends, whatever, this kind of anger became dangerous once it entered the public sphere and is up on YouTube and everyone could be like, oh my God, that's how they really talk about us? That's not okay, right? What I'm interested in here is how this righteous, denunciatory, and mocking anger, how that relates to sort of other forms of affects that are going on in Venezuela, right? In Chile, towards these Venezuelan migrants, right? What kinds of affects do they normally receive? When is it okay for them to be like this when they're, in public space in Chile? All those kinds of things. I also really thought beautifully the paper set up this really nice, way of showing how a kind of linguistic anthropological commitment to things like binary oppositions, which are supposed to be so bad, right, it's not necessarily deterministic, right? I mean, your paper really showed how we have these, quote, binary oppositions, but then people voice them and comment on them and resignify them and flip them, and I just really love that part of the paper. Likewise, Makihara's segment delineates, almost done, the range of affects that her interlocutors have towards the emblem of the flour sack underwear. And these include, as she said, colonial melancholy, joy, nostalgia, shame, delight, this whole, broad range. And here, of course, is the incredibly important principle of indexical indeterminacy, right, which is always at play. So sometimes I go to these other conferences and, I put up a chart with like oppositions and people are like, binary oppositions. And, I can just see like the eye roll and they start saying like words like structuralism. But, I think that just because like they're binary oppositions doesn't mean you're committed to some kind of deterministic vision of meaning, right? And I just thought that your paper did a great job with that. So, while the study of race has mostly focused on affects that map onto figures, that are sort of like properties of figures, like the unemotional Asian or the overly emotional Latina, things like that, what I think your work emphasizes is that a complete account would encompass affects towards figures, right, and other emblems like the underwear, right? So my question here is, what is my question? How can we situate these kinds of affects in relation to the other kinds of dispossessions and productions of inequality that we ordinarily think of as racial, but we want to frame perhaps as just colonialist, right? So is this discourse of the vanishing, the sort of nostalgia, prominent at this point on Easter Island because of economic dislocation, like Marilyn Ivey's argued for Japan? Or how can we situate this kind of hyperbolic denunciation in regard to the other kinds of daily affective experiences that Venezuelan migrants are experiencing in Chile every day, as a kind of reaction to this other thing? How can we think of this as a field of affective relations, constituted in relation to one another? Okay, I thank the organizers once again for the opportunity to comment on this really great set of papers, and I look forward to further discussion of everyone's work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, for those very generous and very helpful comments. I think maybe we can have like one or two questions, and then we should probably vacate because I think this room becomes the keynote room. So if anybody has any questions, yeah, please.
Hi, I have a question for Sara. I don't know if she's still on Zoom.
I'm here.
Hi, Sara. I really liked your paper, and I had a question I know that this isn't quite the focus of your talk, but I'm curious if I'm thinking about Dominican identity in Santurce and Calle Luisa and some of the similar areas of San Juan that I'm aware of that are gentrifying. And I don't know if you have any observations about Dominican identity and what's happening with that in terms of redevelopment and the changes happening in the area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I think that's definitely very important to bring up, given it's Santurce in general has a very large Dominican community. Something that I couldn't mention in my presentation is that this work is based on my master's thesis research, and originally I planned to do an ethnographic field work in Calle Loíza, and then the COVID pandemic started, so I just did the online digital analysis. But that's definitely something that I'm going to be looking into in my future work, right? So for my doctoral dissertation, I'm going to be conducting field work in Santurce, where I can hopefully write, or I aim to get more into whose experiences I'm talking about, right? Because that's something that I couldn't get at in conducting online discourse analysis. But yeah, that's something that I will definitely be looking more into. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry to after the end of this session, and they have to take the wall out for the keynote. So I really hate to have to chase everybody out, but thank you so much. Excellent, excellent.